and we will start now with that first essay, Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, and hopefully many more videos will follow soon after, trying to work our way through this book in its entirety. Alright, so before we get into the content of the essay itself, I think it would be important to note that one of the key motivations for Nick Land's early work, which is put on display here, is his attempt to describe a certain as yet unacknowledged structural isomorphism between capital on the one hand and Kant's model of experience on the other, insofar as both of these things presuppose a disavowed interaction with otherness, which is dominated by a form of exchange which is given in advance, but which still somehow ends up generating a problematic surplus, largely through being caught up in the tension of an inhibited synthesis. Now, that's kind of a mouthful, but we can break that down into simpler terms by noticing that capital, for example, embodies this paradox through positing money as that pre-given abstract form of exchange, in that no matter which particular commodity one happens to be buying or which human agent one happens to be trading with, money will still function as the same generic, universally transmissible form which can determine in advance how exactly one will deal with the other. In much the same way, Kant's universal structures of experience provide abstract forms such as, say, space and time. These are things which do not really exist as properties of the thing in itself, but are rather, to put it very crudely, they're subjective filters through which objects appear, but which the subject had already posited in advance. You also have the categories. These are pure concepts, that is to say, concepts never derived from experience, because they're basically concepts which have to be presupposed in order for you to have experiences. These are things like the category of substance, the category of cause and effect, etc. You also have rational ideas like, say, the rational idea of the world. Reason is smart enough to understand that a certain completeness should be posited with regard to, say, the world that it inhabits, but it does not actually discover that completeness as a real feature of the thing in itself, and this is precisely why it is able to get stuck in the endless game of metaphysics. It is smart enough to posit these unsolvable mysteries regarding the cosmos. Is it limited or is it limitless? Did time have a beginning or is it infinite? Does freedom exist because I can act spontaneously, or does freedom not exist because everything is determined by causes and effect, a chain of cause-effect relations? So reason is smart enough not only to pose these questions, but to invest an enormous amount of time and effort into trying to work them out, even though the game effectively does not have any way out of that labyrinth. And this is just another example of the way that you have these forms which are given in advance and can universally accommodate any object of experience, no matter what the latter happens to be. In both cases, though, despite the fact that one had fulfilled the a priori requirement of providing a rationalized structure to account for otherness, this relation cannot help but generate a problematic surplus, which other thinkers from, say, German idealist and Marxist approaches might have dealt with through dialectical resolution of contradictions, but Nick Land differs from such an approach by thinking of this tension in terms of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. In the 1988 essay, Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest, he uses these intellectual resources to demonstrate the full extent to which the modern nation-state is a paradoxical structure defined by a type of continual suspension between the conflicting tendencies towards deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Nick Land explains in this essay that on one hand, capitalism liberates the tendency towards synthesis by opening the floodgates for modernized forms of, say, trade and internationalization to occur, and it does this through explicitly deterritorializing the flow of people, goods, and services away from any archaic or tribal models of chauvinism, which had been dominant in the pre-modern past. It is no coincidence that even Habermas himself noted in his defense of the 18th century public sphere that calls for democratic political equality during the Enlightenment had explicitly demanded that the proto-capitalist market transaction of democratic purchasing power simply be applied to political procedures as well. In other words, just as anyone could buy anything so long as he or she had the money, it was argued at that time that anyone should be allowed to vote for any party or politician that person happened to prefer on almost consumeristic grounds, so long as one adhered to the right abstract political procedures. Similarly, Nick Land notices that capitalism deterritorializes in this sense, but he warns that capitalism also reterritorializes these same tendencies into strict nation-state forms, and it does this through maintaining, ironically enough, patriarchal structures in the very precise sense that one's father's last name and one's father's homeland, otherwise known as the nation of which one is a citizen, still territorialize one's personal identification in modernity in a suffocatingly constricting manner. In contrast with the kind of opportunistic feminist grifters like, say, Anita Sarkeesian, Nick Land's critique of patriarchy was based on his realization that this too is just another form of the same problem of an abstract exchange form as one could already find in both capital and Kant structures of experience, since the means of marrying women off to suitors from outside of one's immediate family in traditional times could be counted on to prevent that uniquely undesirable problem of inbreeding. No matter which tribal elder or which tribe one happened to be dealing with, these would still function about the same. More specifically, Nick Land attempted to grapple with the serious theoretical challenge inherent in Levi-Strauss's claims that the prohibition against incest tends to be combined with its extreme opposite, which is the prohibition against interracial marriage. Another conflict between deterritorialization and reterritorialization, which ends up generating a problematic surplus. Nick Land humorously noted that this traditional mandate to avoid both inbreeding and also to avoid marrying foreigners would seem to be self-contradictory, because it does not really get any more exogamic than marrying those people whose ancestral lines had developed on another continent for millennia into the past. For example, if someone from Norway marries someone from El Salvador, we can pretty well rule out in advance the problem of inbreeding between those two. Above all, Nick Land distinguishes himself from more conventional Marxists by arguing that this puzzling formulation of the incest prohibition is not merely an ideological superstructure, which reiterates the underlying economic logic of that capitalist material base from a second removal, but is instead integral to understanding how capital itself functions. The better structural description for capital, then, is not the Marxist cliché of surplus value, but is instead this general process of displacement, which is clearly visible in the tendency for the first world to export its own political instability from the imperial center into the third world, and for people's rational decision-making procedures to be similarly displaced into the consumeristic abstraction of so many impersonal market transactions. In this particular essay, Nick Land focused on the phenomenon of South African apartheid as a uniquely useful example of the strange sense in which the capitalist, much like the Kantian subject or the tribal elder attempting to work out an arranged marriage, requires both of the following seemingly contradictory conditions to be true at the same time. On one hand, the exploited proletariat must maintain a physical status as other through being literally displaced from the nation space into a position of geographical alterity, such as through concentrating third world wage laborers into slums which lie on the other side of some political boundary. Simultaneously, the other is required to be compelled into the labor market as a poorly paid worker whose financial exploitation keeps the capitalist machine functioning on a day-to-day level. Mass crossings over that border to work daily shifts within the system, such as you find with, say, crossing from Tijuana into California, or from the narco-controlled favelas into the government-controlled areas of Brazil, etc., will these satisfy the conditions of economic proximity and political distantiation at the same time? Far from being unique to South Africa, though, this paradoxical model of disavowed interaction with alterity makes up the theoretical archetype for the modern nation-state as such. Nick Land went as far as to explicitly designate this as the microcosm of the neo-colonial order and a picture of our world in miniature, insofar as capitalism currently survives through utilizing labor through a set of geographical relations modeled on national sovereignty, to use his own phrase. The third world is itself, in other words, just a massive external slum whose labor fuels the global capitalist machine, even as it is geographically segregated into a physical position of alterity so far removed from the first world as to be both out of sight and out of mind. Nick Land warned, however, that even the first world itself does not escape this contradiction between deterritorialization and reterritorialization, for it too is plagued by a type of hardwired and continual displacement, whereby people's rational decision-making is perpetually deferred into so many impersonal market transactions, which only ever succeed in preventing one from being able to think clearly enough about what it is one is doing to seriously critique global capitalism's many flaws, let alone the deeper structural reasons for their existence. Nick Land argued that this displacement really is the ultimate base of capital accumulation, and for that very reason it can only be sustained through the territorialization of a certain patriarchal marriage organization, which is not merely epiphenomenal, superstructural, or some ideological distortion of the underlying real material base. In fact, Nick Land opened the essay itself by noting that Kant literally extended this prohibition against intermixing to the non-economic realms of concept and intuition as well, since the latter are required to differentiate themselves in order to maintain the structural integrity of experience, a phenomenological equivalent, really, of Levi-Strauss's recognition of the irony that cultures are caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to forbid both incest and race mixing, which, if you think about it, would be the ultimate form of exogamy. Nick Land noted that because the prohibition against incest is fundamentally a matter of how the relation to alterity occurs, the stability of the male line is just one more form of identity qua territorialization, much like economic exchange or the Kantian universal structures of experience. Yet for this very reason, patriarchy is defined by the same sort of inhibition which plagues the Kantian drive towards synthesis. Nick Land noted that Enlightenment modernity really cannot be described as anything except a type of inhibited synthesis which is structurally isomorphic to a set of unresolved dilemmas lying in Kant's body of work as well. For example, the attempt to territorialize this minimal difference in both cases misses the point that this tension is itself the source of growth within that system. Kant's question, where does new knowledge come from, really is just the same question, where does growth come from, as phrased by the capitalist. Yet whereas Kant implicitly assumes a correlationist thesis regarding experience in which anything outside the subject must correlate with it through conforming to a set of pre-given a priori structures lying within the subject, Deleuze and Guattari broke from this tradition by instead rephrasing the problem of a subject's epistemological knowledge as a problem of desiring production, with no need to be qualified by any humanistic criteria whatsoever. Likewise, with Kant, we find that this thing which is in advance, that is to say, the a priori, is itself the predominant trait of our contemporary reason. This is because whereas the theocracies of the Middle Ages were stagnant, modern societies are characterized by an explosive possibility of novelty on earth, but only insofar as the proper form for interacting with that otherness is already given in advance. This, however, only ends up shackling this new history by systematically compromising it, to quote Land himself. Enlightenment is therefore fundamentally ambiguous, insofar as it is similarly defined by a continual suspension between the conflicting tendency towards learning the new and legislating it with laws that are old or already known. In Capital, this becomes the conflict between wanting to expand and wanting to reproduce itself as the same, which, in the form of suburbia, becomes a cancer that can turn an entire continent into exactly the same thing. The outside, therefore, both attracts and repels, because it is both desired and hated at once. Land questions, therefore, whether such alterity really is dealt with as alterity, if it is always already predetermined by some universal form which is given in advance of that encounter itself. He calls this an obliteration of the other which will always already have torn out its tongue. Kant exemplifies this problem particularly well insofar as he overcame David Hume's drive towards universal skepticism by locating necessity not within the thing in itself, as Hume proved was impossible, in the sense that you can never actually derive laws of cause and effect from the empirical observation of real things in the world, but rather, as Kant would say, locating them in the a priori structures of the subject himself or herself. Nick Land notes, however, that Kant still suffers from a certain conflict in that synthetic a priori knowledge, such as you find with, say, geometry or arithmetic, is something which is both already known, because this knowledge is a priori, and yet it still somehow adds to what we knew, since it does more than just provide an analytic tautology which is true only because it does not contradict itself. So the classic example of an analytic a priori statement is, for example, all bodies are extended. Well, if we know that it's a body, we already know that it's extended because that simply paraphrases the same idea with different symbols. Euclidean geometry, however, does not simply do that, because this is knowledge which requires a certain intuition to present new information, which cannot be known simply through analyzing the concepts themselves. For example, we never actually see the purified triangle, the pure line, point, or circle as things which exist in the real world, because these are not material entities. These are objects of a certain eternal or purified knowledge, which must be a priori, yet somehow still require intuition to present the experience to you. Kant solved this dilemma by noting that you have an intuition of space, but simply one which is purified to demonstrate truths of geometry, such as a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, or the truth that all of the angles of a triangle still add up to the same amount. 5 plus 7 equals 12, similarly, is not just an empty tautology, because the number 12 does not merely paraphrase the expression 7 plus 5 with different symbols. If you only have access to the concepts of these numbers, you can never actually succeed in leaping from one side of that equation to the other. You need certain presentation of this information within intuition, albeit a purified intuition of time. Nick Land revises the way that we usually think about the history of modern philosophy by noting that the real point about rationalism and empiricism is just how each one of these deals with the outside. Empiricists, for example, emphasize what is outside the subject's inherent faculty of reason by dwelling on mundane observations about objects in the real world, such as the contingent state of affairs that the city of Calcutta just happens to be located in the Indian state of West Bengal. Rationalists, on the other hand, tend to emphasize what is already inside the subject's faculty of reason by dwelling on abstract truths like a square cannot be a circle. All you need is your own mind to know that that is true. Kant differed from both of these approaches by requiring a new type of object altogether to have such synthetic a priori knowledge as we discussed on the previous slide. This new kind of object really was just the conditions of experience as such. the conditions of experience is a strange kind of object because it tells you about experience without itself being that experience. This really is, then, just the universal form for how we relate to alterity, turned into a perverse object of study in itself. For it is the exchange value that first allows a thing to be marketed to the Enlightenment mind, to use Land's own phrase. Kant's correlationism is a type of inhibited synthesis because the universal form of experience ultimately is just a type of exchange form which precedes the encounter with newness and alterity by providing the coordinates for how to conduct exchange with it beforehand, much like the exchange form of capitalism. For example, money is no commodity as such, but only the form which tells you how to exchange other commodities. It is still somehow misrecognized, though, as having a positive value and content in itself. What falls outside the commodity form, Nick Land reminds us, is just the massive excess of anarchic slums. The ultimate law, similarly, within Kant's system is the categorical imperative, in which a given act is ethical only if it is pure form subtracted from any pathological matter, which might distort your motives for acting by, say, seeking out pleasure for yourself on a bodily level, and therefore a form which is pure because it can be applied to any subject whatsoever without any further context. It's not just your law, it's everyone's law. This, though, is the ultimate slaving of reality to ideality, in which my own act in the real world has to be dominated in advance by the pure ethical law. Because Kant controls trade by restricting newness to identity and the universal form of exchange value, this leads to the ridiculousness of the idealist calling into question the existence of matter itself. However, Kant's insistence that trying to apply the categories to some reality lying beyond the appearance only leads to empty metaphysics, which cannot be free from antinomies in which a thesis and its antithesis simultaneously must both be true. That is to say, cosmos has a limit and doesn't. Time had a beginning and didn't. This is problematic because reality is itself a transcendental concept. And this is just one more example of a conflict within Kant's system which cannot be resolved with the resources of that same system of thought. Because of this tension, at certain points, Kant actually gives way to the metaphysics of excess, dealing with things like the genius of the artist or the sublime experience of art as such an excess which explicitly lies beyond the pure form of exchange which is given in advance. According to Levi-Strauss, similarly, normal food is that which is consumed by the same people who produce it, while rich food is that which is given to another. This logical criteria is necessary, he says, to maintain a differentiation of tribes through having separate systems of production, even on so basic a level as this. Filiation, then, is relation by blood to the same, in much the same way that normal food is the food eaten by the people who produce it, while rationalism is the focus on truths which came from the inside of my own mind. Alliance on an anthropological level is then relation by marriage, which is, of course, to the other, and is structurally analogous to the rich food eaten by people who did not produce it, or empiricism, which focuses on truth lying outside of my mind. Rich food, therefore, is the primordial element of trade, which precedes the modern commodity form, as the way to deal with the other, but in a regulated manner, but is therefore a suppression of the radical synthesis all the same. Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus, however, really do provide a decorrelationist system of thought, and the de-individualized desire, which is no longer that of a particular person, but rather becomes a type of machinic desire. The question for them is no longer finding the eternal structures of the Oedipal triangle, which lie beyond desire in some dualistic sense of providing the transcendental coordinates which must already be given in advance, but rather of understanding everything as machines, connected to other machines, producing production as something real rather than getting lost in the idealistic fantasy of lack, as you would find with, say, Jacques Lacan. No longer a matter of how matter is idealized, but rather of how ideality materializes itself through the auto-production of reality qua a type of desiring. Because Kant required the experience of an object lying on the outside to first pass by way of the a priori structures on the inside of the subject, Nick Land noted that this frantic codification of desire into isolated circuits is the true meaning of xenophobia, in that what mainstream SJWs and liberal elite tend to miss is that this literal fear of the foreign is nothing more than the violent attempt to conserve the territorialization of identity at any cost. In addition, Nick Land identified the irony that capitalism was internationalized without unwinding the traditional structures of patriarchy after all, for the latter were even more deeply entrenched through the phenomenon of modern nationalism, which simply radicalized the requirements for the father's homeland to be protected against mixing from the outside on a national level. Capital demonstrates an extreme frustration of the cultural tendency towards expansive exogamy, insofar as capital is precisely the point at which a culture refuses the possibility of pushing the prohibition of incest towards its limit, to quote Land himself. Because the deterritorialization of tribal kinship patterns is paired with nationalistic reterritorializations, Land concluded the essay by speculating that any release of these inhibited powers must lie in the kind of revolution which would dismantle the nation-state and the patriarchy through deconstructing the means of segmenting women on the basis of their husband or their father's identifications. Because women have been traditionally traded as passive objects, rather than perform that trading actively themselves as free subjects, they lack direct investment in the patriarchal inhibition, and therefore hold the potential to be the bearers of a certain revolutionary destiny, which could dismantle the very coordinates of the system from within. The Amazonian revolution, which, say, Julius Evola considered to be a perversion of proper traditionalist form, is, for Nick Land, the site which would hold the potential to push through a revolutionary detonation of the ticking time bomb of the system's own conflicting tendencies. Nick Land assures us, then, that Amazonianism is not merely a negative phenomenon lacking the full being of tradition, as Julius Evola would hold, but is instead the site in which a certain acceleration of intensity could be pushed to the point of explosion. In an early reference to quasi-accelerationist ideas, then, we find Nick Land dismiss previous non-violent forms of pseudo-feminism by explicitly affirming an approach that accelerates violence to the point of blowing up the structures of the system themselves. As I quote him, "The state apparatus of an advanced industrial society can certainly not be defeated without a willingness to escalate the cycle of violence without limit. It is a terrible fact that atrocity is not the perversion, but the very motor of such struggles. A revolutionary war against the modern metropolis can only be fought in hell," end quote. In other words, only the abolition of the inhibition of synthesis of Kantian thought, through fostering new Amazons in our midst, to quote Land himself, can drive the system to undo itself from within. Likewise, accelerationism differs from dialectic in that tension is not peacefully overcome through rising up to a higher perspectival reconciliation with negativity, to use Zizek's phrase, but is rather intensified intentionally to the point of combustion. It would be useful to consider how Deleuze understood intensity in qualitative leaps to make sense of why Land's references to revolution are categorically different from any traditional Marxist use of that term. Deleuze noted that we are often inhibited from understanding qualitative leaps through mistakenly smuggling in metaphors from unrelated quantitative and extensive ideas. For example, whereas cutting a 5-foot segment of rope in half is a quantitative change of an extensive thing, shifting from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit is an intensive shift and a qualitative leap. Quite fittingly, Deleuze also included accelerating in the literal sense of going from a low speed to a high speed as another example of such an intensive leap, which cannot be understood through spatial metaphor. In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari applied the same idea to the problem of desire by identifying Freud's primary shortcoming as his tendency to feel forced to always subordinate desire to some transcendent fixed structure by reinterpreting pretty much any manifestation of it whatsoever through the pre-given Oedipal triangle featuring the generic placeholders of mommy, daddy, and me. Deleuze and Guattari argued, in contrast, that this attitude misses the point that desire is always an imminent discharge of productive energies rather than a secondary reaction to some pre-given lack, in which case it would have to be structured by some transcendent grid of predetermined abstract coordinates. For this reason, Deleuze and Guattari re-evaluated the schizo as, by definition, the position which lies at the limit of territorialization. Much like Nick Land's Amazonians, who could blow up the system of patriarchy from within, the schizo provides the site for a deterritorialization of a line of flight to occur from a disavowed sector of the system itself.